Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and what you see up here hanging off the ceiling is a little fan that I had set up to shoot air down onto my bench, and I've been using that thing to try to dry off the material in a couple of my worm bins where the material has just gotten way too damp and muddy and clumpy. But right now I've cleared off the bench so that we can feed a couple of other systems. I've got a whole bunch of food for these guys. Look at this. This is a lot of watermelon rinds. And it's got some good weight to it. It's probably, if it's just liquid, if there's nothing more than liquid in here, I would probably guess that it's at least a half a gallon of just maybe liquid. So I want to get those things into the worm bin soon before they start to just melt and dump a bunch of liquid into that little container there. The systems that I'd like to take care of getting fed today are right behind me, covered in plastic. I believe that the plastic covering has actually been, to a certain degree, the reason for a whole lot of the moisture remaining in the systems, possibly getting things too damp. So I'm going to definitely be considering the the retirement of those pieces of plastic as coverings in those systems, because as you can see, many of my other systems are already only covered with paper, and I might be doing the same in those systems. But we'll see when we get in there to see if things are starting to get a little bit overly damp. If so, we'll get rid of the plastic coverings. We're going to give them this fairly moisture-rich feeding, possibly cover up with something that's going to allow for some of that moisture to escape if it starts to look like it's a bit much in there. So I'm going to put on a glove, get those systems up on the bench, and we're going to get to work. So I've already kind of preemptively prepared a couple sheets of replacement top coverings, which can go in the place of these pieces of plastic. So I definitely like the idea of swapping out the plastic coverings. Just looking to see if there's any other worms. I did find one worm crawling on this plastic covering. So let's see if we have any worms hanging out on this one over here. I definitely like the idea of getting rid of the plastic in most of my systems. I think only because I'm just a little bit gun shy about seeing things take a turn for the worse. I mean, these are relatively young bins compared to some of my older systems. These systems are now, how old are they? 16 weeks. What is that? 112 days. So my game plan was to just sort of leave those plastic coverings off and then maybe use all these existing pieces of paper that are in here already and just use a couple replacement brand new pieces, 2 per container, and then maybe kind of skew them a little bit like this to get most of the surface covered. And then all this stuff can just go right down into the feeding area as supplementary bedding with the feeding. It's a little bit interesting to find that the worms haven't really devoured these top covering newspapers. Sometimes I wonder if the reason for that is just the fact that the system is still young enough and still has plenty of bedding type materials down low within the container. Because a lot of times the worms come up for these top covering sheets of paper and they just nibble the heck out of them. But these are just holding together very well. I mean, it has only been 11 days since we last checked in here. Perhaps if we were to just let the systems run for a bit longer, perhaps the worms would have spent more time on the surface and possibly ripped into these top coverings a bit more. Who knows? You never know what's going on with the worms. They have a mind of their own, it seems. I was actually thinking that maybe those 2 coffee filters that were out here on top could stay in the function that they were serving, which was just feeding zone indicators, but the newspaper bits that were out on top, I believe those would actually be kind of nice as supplementary bedding down beneath the feeding. So I mean, right away I'm already getting that feeling like things are way too damp. So we're definitely leaving the plastic off. And I'm even kind of tempted to come in here with some completely dry, freshly cut cardboard and newspaper. Usually I use that freshly shredded cardboard and newspaper mix combined with moisture and leaves to make my prepared bedding, but I do have some that I just ran through the shredder and I never made prepared bedding out of it yet. So I'm almost wondering if we'd be wise to just drop in some of that dry shredded material and just combine it with this stuff, since it is kind of damp in certain places. The stuff we fed last time was also a very moisture-rich feeding, very similar to what they're getting today. Today it's all watermelon. Last time it was a combination of watermelon and cantaloupe melon rinds. It seems very unlikely that we would find any of that down here. So here you can see some leftovers of the prepared bedding we dropped in underneath the feeding last time. And then other little scraps of paper here and there. Yeah, you know. Yep, here we go. A little piece of melon rind, watermelon rind right there. I don't know. I just worry that things get overly damp. This is the seed from an avocado. A piece of food which, after a period of time, will become quite easy to break. If you were to just take one of these straight out of the avocado and try to do this, you would never be able to, because it's just way too tough and hard. But stuff starts to just crumble away in time in the worm bin. The fact that we're finding one here in this bin means we're going to find one in the other bin. Usually with these sort of twin bins or sister bins, we feed very similarly in both systems. So that would have been the case here too. That means if one system got something, it's highly likely that the other system got something just like it as well. I don't know. Do we need to go with the dry stuff? At this age, it does seem like there's plenty of time for things to bounce back and for some of this seemingly excess moisture to perhaps be more of a benefit than a problem. I do feel like there's a good bit of bedding just in general throughout the system, so it's not just big mounds of castings only, which if they did get this damp would just start to chunk together and become big masses of mud. But here it does feel like maybe it's not really that big of a risk to just leave it. And let's not forget, we will be leaving off the plastic covering, so there will be that additional factor of the system being able to lose some of its moisture to evaporation through the replacement top covering pieces of newspaper that we're placing on top. But I'm also, you know, not forgetting the nature of the feeding that they're getting today, which is so heavily rich in moisture, all that watermelon. Especially since it was frozen, as the stuff thaws, it's just going to release so much of its moisture rapidly that I could see the middle of this bin getting pretty soggy after we put that stuff in here. You know, maybe there is a use for that prepared, not the prepared bedding that's already dampened, but just the dry shredded newspaper and cardboard. Maybe that can become the bedding foundation for this very soggy feeding that they're getting today. And putting it in dry will give all that moisture somewhere to go. It can just soak right into all that shredded cardboard and newspaper. And then like I said before, we'll be demoting those plastic coverings and covering up with only newspaper. So I think that might be the game plan that I'm going to follow. But I want to get things set up in both systems, ready for the feeding to get added. So we're just going to sort of follow suit in this bin with sort of tilling up and aerating the material on this far edge away from me, working my way gradually to where I'm at, and then leaving that nice large opening into which we can drop today's feeding. So here's that other avocado pit. Similarly fragile and easy to break apart. This one already seemed like I might have been already able to break a piece of it off last time we were in here, because I don't think that was a whole seed. I think that was just a fragment of one. Here too, some remaining leftovers from the last feeding, including some of the bedding that was placed in beneath the food. Perhaps even a couple pieces of like cantaloupe rind right there. So I guess my only aim for doing what I'm doing here is just to get the material sort of fluffed up and aerated so as to not let it just all sit matted down upon each other and getting sticky and nasty. Just want to get it all sort of fluffed up a bit, breaking apart anything that I feel to be a little bit chunky and stuck together. So these worms are the worms that I originally got from Gaetano, from Northeast Worms. These systems have lived in a couple containers previous to this, and this was the first opportunity that I had where I felt like I had enough worms to split the population that I had in a single bin into 2 bins. So it is kind of nice that I'm able to finally now be at that point where their numbers have increased enough for me to sustain 2 pretty well populated systems. The estimated worm count in these systems is thought to be around 1,500 worms, perhaps closer to 1,600. And let's not forget, that was the estimate we all came up with together, jointly, 112 days ago when these systems were originally launched. So I always like to assume that the worms are busy reproducing, making more baby worms, increasing those numbers steadily. So even though we thought that there might have been 1,500 some odd worms in here all those weeks ago, it's quite possible that there's even more now. Okay, here's just some more stuff that looks like leftovers of the previous feeding, various stuff that might have been like bedding placed beneath the feeding. Here's some leftover cantaloupe rind. So let's just make sure we've opened up a big enough hole down here, because I would like to be pretty generous on the dry shredded paper and cardboard that I drop in beneath the melon, just to make sure there's enough of it to easily soak in all the moisture that's going to be coming off this stuff. So I'm going to go fetch that now, and I'll be right back. 1 second. Alright, here you go. This is the almost an entire bucket full of this stuff. And I'm just going to go with maybe 2 heaping handfuls into each system. This was the stuff that I thought might be beneficial if I were to just blend it into all the damp material. But when I started tilling it all around and seeing how it was pretty, packed with residual bedding materials, I didn't worry so much. So I think we'll be in good shape. We're probably in a pretty good balance point here, with moisture being injected in with this fairly damp feeding, counterbalanced with a bunch of dry stuff for that moisture to sop into as it starts to thaw out. So this is a somewhat larger feeding than I normally apply in my bins. I mean, just from the weight of it, I can tell that it's more. But when you think about it, when you think about watermelon, a huge amount of what we're, doing here is just adding water. And that was the other reason I wanted to make sure I just kept that in mind, so that we at least don't set ourselves up for the situation becoming way too wet and damp and turning into a situation that we then need to try to correct afterwards. So here too, I'm just placing more bedding on top because it seems like we easily could, and then we'll proceed with covering up. So there's still this section of the bin that's closest to me that we've not even tilled up or examined. I just figured we would just continue in my direction and cover up with some of this material that we've not yet even examined. This stuff too could be pretty damp, especially down low. So I think there's a benefit to bringing that really damp stuff out to the top. Anything that would have been out on the surface, especially around the edges of the plastic, since the plastic was put on these things a little bit loosely, there was a little bit of dry material out on the top surface. Not a whole lot though. But I think we're in good shape here. I think all things considered, we're going to be lined up for a pretty comfortable place for the worms to be. I definitely like the idea that we surfaced a lot of the stuff that was down low and possibly just getting overly damp, getting it out near the surface, and then at the same time submerging some of the stuff that was out near the surface that might have been a bit drier. And then all that dry stuff we just dropped down into the feeding zone. I mean, I'm definitely curious to see how that stuff comes along, right? Because it will absorb moisture from the foods that we just placed in. Not to mention the fact that it'll also absorb moisture from the surrounding castings and material that's being piled on top of it. Just makes me wonder if any of the stuff will just sort of evade getting moist and remain dry, so that by the next time we come back in here, at some point in the near future we'll find possibly little pockets of the material that never got damp, never got infiltrated by any worm traffic. That would be kind of interesting if that were the case, but I really don't know what to expect. I definitely see that happen occasionally in some of my systems, that I put in a nice big wad of bedding material and then it seems like nothing even becomes of it after a period of time between feedings. And then naturally I'll blend it in at that point when I stumble on it, but it's at these times when I'm putting the stuff in that I kind of question whether or not it's going to do the same thing, or if it's going to become adopted by the worms to get utilized. And you know, I got so distracted by the fact that I wanted to bring in dry bedding that I totally forgot that we had leftover newspaper bits that we wanted to incorporate as bedding down in the feeding areas too. This stuff, all the stuff that we pulled off the off the top. So I guess, you know, we'll have to just adapt to my lack of paying attention. So we'll just sort of come back in with this stuff the way it was when we found it. No harm in leaving it kind of the way we found it, but the one change that we will make for sure, that we discussed earlier, which is the exclusion of the plastic coverings going back on. I definitely like that idea. I definitely have no concerns about the systems getting possibly too dry by not being protected with plastic coverings to prevent evaporation. In this humid weather we've been having lately, there's just been virtually no chance for things to dry due to evaporation. So I think by putting those two pieces of newspaper out on top of all this stuff as the final top covering, I think we'll be in pretty decent shape. However, most of this paper will probably remain somewhat dry as a result of being kind of exposed pretty directly to airflow into drying. But I think there will be a definite benefit to not going back on with the plastic coverings at this point. A little bit of air openings to allow for ventilation over there, not to mention the fact that this is paper, so that too will just simply permit some ventilation through itself. And I'll be curious to see how things look in here next time. I think they'll be good. I don't think we have anything to worry about in terms of things possibly getting too dry. I think more importantly, I think the measures we've taken here are going to be good things to prevent things from just getting overly damp, which is the main area of my concern. So I'll be heading to the sink in a moment, so getting my clean hand dirty at this point is fine. I just want to get some of this material back down into the worm bin instead of sending it down the drain at the sink. So that's it for our check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. As always, if you did, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.